welcome to America at its Best. My name is Rebecca Painter and I'll be your host for today's show. We started this show right around the time that a state economy started shutting down. And if you hear the screaming in the background, by the way, I have to pause for a moment. It is my 1-year-old who's not too far away, also not quarantined, but social distancing from me while I'm at the show. Anyways, we started the show because things shut down, daycares were closed, husbands stayed home from work with their wives who work from home anyways, like myself. And we wanted to tell you guys some good news. There's a lot of stressors going on for people personally and also just out there in the world right now. And there are so many great things happening because of you. So that's why we're all here. I hope you enjoy the next 45 minutes as we get started and bring you the good news that you've made possible. So I'm coming to you guys from Columbia, South Carolina, where just yesterday my city council passed an ordinance that requires us to wear a mask when we're out in public. I don't really mind to wear a mask out in public, like no big deal. What I do mind is that all of these seemingly little things are starting to add up to a point where they're taking away my freedom to make a decision about what is best for myself and my family. And that's what we're going to be talking about on today's show, how some of these little things are snowballing into much bigger things and starting to take away civil liberties of folks across the nation. And we're going to be talking about how this network is defending those civil liberties through our litigation efforts. We'll be joined today by Carrie Ann, who is the founder and CEO of American Jurislink. We'll also be joined by Sam McRoberts, who's the litigation director and general counsel of the Kansas Justice Institute. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate it.
We'll hear from you guys a little bit more in just a minute. First, let's hear from our fearless leader of State Policy Network, Ms. Tracy Sharp. Tracy, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Rebecca. It's a sunny day here in California.
Well, that's good. I know there have been some rough ones. So Tracy, let's just get right to it. State Policy Network, people hear that and they think, think tank in every state. How did we go from talking about think tanks to having a long-term litigation strategy?
This component, I'm really glad we're covering this today because it's such an important tool in our arsenal. This component, the litigation component, came as a response to increasing threats at the state level. The state think tanks saw a gap in protecting good laws that got passed from being overturned and stopping bad laws. So in 2007, the Goldwater Institute took a page out of the Institute for Justice playbook and with the help of Clint Bullock, launched the first state-based litigation center. So now we know, of course, Clint went on to become an Arizona State Supreme Court judge, and we're happy for him. But since then, since 2007, there have been no less than 15 state-based litigation centers that have launched, many of those affiliated with the state-based think tank. So, and there's a reason for this rapid growth. It works, right? No single solitary path to liberty. The state think tanks, this network will use whatever tool is at their disposal, whether that's legislation or lobbying where it's allowable, influencing in the media, and of course, litigation. And so this is how, in numerous ways, we work to protect and promote liberty out in the states for the long term.
That's great, Tracy. Now, in a minute, as I mentioned earlier, we'll hear from Carrie Ann from American Jurislink. It's a fantastic organization, and SPN had a role in incubating that organization. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, this is a great example where we see a need and we work to meet a need. Carrie Ann, who used to be at Goldwater and has a lot of experience in the litigation field, came to us interested in starting a peer network, a peer mentoring group like State Policy Network, working alongside of her to help with strategic planning, help set up an organization, and to accelerate that process of incubation has brought us to this point, and at a great inflection point when we need the hammer of litigation more than ever. So there are so many public interest litigation firms out there. They could really benefit from the sharing of ideas, from the connectivity that an organization like what Carrie Ann's running could do. So we were really pleased to come alongside and help speed up that process and bring it to fruition.
That's great. Well, with that, let's turn over to Carrie Ann Donnell and talk a little bit more about American Jurislink. Carrie Ann, welcome to the show. There you are. Hey, now listen, as I understand it, you officially launched American Jurislink, and then a few months later, the pandemic hit. You're home with 2 kids under 6, so you understand this baby in the background that I'm dealing with. How is all that going?
Yes, well, my kids are loving it. They're having a ball, and our next door neighbors gave us a trampoline about a week into the pandemic. So we were really sitting pretty good in our neighborhood here. All things considered, it definitely is better than it could be.
Those are good neighbors.
Yeah.
Now, let's dive into American Jurislink. Tell us, what is American Jurislink?
Yeah, so as Tracy mentioned, SPN played a crucial role in our development, and they're just the perfect organization to have helped us start up and mentor us, and they continue to mentor us. American Jurislink is basically like the SPN for litigators. SPN plays that huge connector role for lots of different types of positions in the policy world, and American Jurislink is that for public interest litigators. What we do is connect, build up, and build out litigation that advances freedom and the rule of law.
So I can only imagine that you've had your hands full since the pandemic hit in terms of litigating. What kind of issues are you seeing with COVID cases?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer because there's just so many. What issues are we not seeing in these COVID cases? I feel like I would be reaching to try to find a constitutional law issue that our attorneys have worked with over the years that has not come up multiple times in the COVID context. I mean, yesterday I counted at least 20 different constitutional law claims that we're seeing repeatedly in the COVID context. And these are not obscure claims. These are not weird areas of law. These are all fundamental liberties that probably viewers on this call find very, very concerning, and
Can you give me some examples?
Very familiar with.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure. So, I mean, if we start with the first, the first liberty in the First Amendment, it goes from A to Z, basically. So the freedom of religion, the first liberty, churches have been shut down because of these COVID orders. And one of the worst infringements that we saw was in Mississippi against the King James Bible Baptist Church. So the church started drive-in services, and this was in the thick of the pandemic when everything was shut down. And they also had social distancing within their drive-in services. So the cars were literally parked 6 feet apart from each other, and their windows were rolled up. And they would pull into the service, and the pastor would stand in the parking lot and preach. And the police department in the city actually showed up at the service and threatened to fine everybody or take them to jail if they continued staying in this drive-in, socially distanced church service. So that's pretty outrageous. The Mississippi Justice Institute filed a lawsuit, and they were successful. The city ended up changing its order. But like I said, it runs the spectrum. I mean, there's multiple claims in the First Amendment. Another really outrageous one we saw in the First Amendment was a freedom of speech violation, which you think, well, that shouldn't be such a huge issue in these shutdown orders. It's a virus. How are we seeing these violations? And it was actually a social media speech case. So what happened was there was a gal named Amaya, who's a teenager, and this was kind of early in the pandemic. She went to Florida for spring break, and she came back with COVID-like symptoms. She felt sick. She went to the doctor. She got tested for the virus. She tested negative, but her doctors told her, you actually missed the testing window with your symptoms and how it went. You probably actually did have the virus. So she posted on her Instagram that she had the virus and that she was, getting over it and that she had recovered. And the county sheriff knocked on her door at home and said, "You've got to take down your Instagram post or we're going to arrest you for disorderly conduct," this teenager. So pretty outrageous how the virus is really touching all of our fundamental liberties. In that case, the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty filed a lawsuit. That case, believe it or not, hasn't settled. It's actually still pending. So we're really seeing the spectrum. Speech and religion are among the most fundamental rights, but pretty much anything that anybody on this call would think of, we've seen multiple cases on, assembly, equal protection, due process, Commerce Clause, separation of powers. I won't go on and on, but you get the gist.
Yes. In other words, you have had your hands full. That's amazing. So there are so many examples, and you've been in this world for a long time, Carrie Ann. If you had to think about a couple of examples of cases or topics that you think matter most in terms of shaping the future of our country that are out there right now, what would you point to?
Yeah, I think the ones that I just mentioned are pretty big. I think we are, it's great that the ones that I mentioned we're winning. The drive-in church services cases, we're winning. I expect that we will see a victory in Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberties free speech case. Another one that is going well has been gun stores. Some places, not all, but some governors did shut down gun stores as part of their closures of non-essential businesses. And you have a right to bear arms issue there. That's a Second Amendment violation, and those cases are generally winning. On the flip side, the ones that we're concerned about that are not going well would be the economic ones. So, if it's not a gun store, if it's a regular run-of-the-mill business, like, a restaurant suing because the government shut down their dine-in services, those cases are losing. And those are the ones we're concerned about, setting bad precedent for us. So those cases are being filed under the takings clause, which says that the government can't come in and take your property without compensating you for the value of that property. Now, in the shutdown orders, the government isn't coming in and physically taking anybody's property, but they're basically regulating you out of the value of it when they tell you that you can keep your restaurant, you just can't open it. We're losing these cases. These cases typically aren't the ones that are filed by the lawyers in our network. These are ones filed by lawyers outside of our network who haven't lived and breathed with the takings clause for decades like our lawyers have. And our lawyers expect these cases to be losing. We're hoping that, we can move the law in that area. And so eventually those cases could be successful, but we're not there yet.
What does it take to get there?
That's a great question. I think it takes a lot of strategy and it takes a lot of unification. Bad precedent is a concern that all lawyers have, especially the public interest litigators. And it's really important for us to be strategic and unified. So one of the things that we're doing is developing or hosting roundtables for our litigators who can just get together every couple of weeks in this super fast changing high volume environment, and we can strategize together to make sure that we're not taking a step in a direction that isn't wise, that we've had time to think it through. And when I say time, we're talking about sometimes hours or days, but at least if we can all get together and you have the benefit of multiple points of view and really high level strategic thinkers, we can move forward a lot more carefully. And then on the other side, for the lawyers who are outside of our network, one of the things that we're doing is actually a project with Ballotpedia, and we are putting together a case tracker of all of these civil liberty COVID actions that's going to be posted on Ballotpedia's website. In fact, we've started it already, and so you can see a list of all of the hundreds of different civil liberty COVID cases. We're going to be building that out, where we're going to be providing more details so that even lawyers who are outside of our network can see things like, hey, there's all these takings claims that have been filed and they're all losing. So maybe it's not wise to continue to file these.
Mm-hmm. And so all of these COVID claims that have been happening, we're at a point now, depending, I guess, on what time of day it is, where a lot of folks are starting to reopen. Some areas of the country, the COVID stuff is getting more relaxed. Do you think you'll see fewer cases in that case?
No, I don't. I think the cases are going to continue. In fact, as things are reopening, they're often reopening at a pace that is problematic for equal protection or due process. So, for example, in Connecticut, the governor allowed hair salons to open, but not nail salons. And there's no, reasonable reason for that kind of order of succession there. And that's a problem, like I said, for equal protection. It's also a due process problem. And I think we're going to continue to see these orders come out in problematic ways, the reopening orders. And we're also seeing orders continue to new orders, new restrictions to continue to come down. So I live in Arizona, and we haven't been required to wear masks up until a couple of days ago. Where our COVID cases have spiked, but I imagine even in other places, the restrictions are going to kind of wax and wane for a little while. And as we see that, we're going to continue to see more cases being filed.
And how do these COVID cases, oh, Tracy, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to emphasize, because the uncertainty is so high, that the service that Carrie Ann's providing of the info sharing, the intel gathering, it helps all these groups be more strategic and more effective. It's a powerful tool when there's so much uncertainty that we're trying to navigate. So I wanted to throw that in.
Yeah. So how exactly would you compare the COVID litigation that's all over the place right now to the life of litigators and this network before March of 2020?
Yeah, well, I mean, the last big change that we saw, we would probably say, wow, this is so different. We've never seen it before, but I can't stop myself from saying the COVID situation is so different and we've never seen it before. But I'll talk maybe about a few of the specific ways that make that COVID is very different than what we've seen before. So the first one is just the volume. And again, I feel like I've said it before, but the last time we looked at it was in the Janus context. So the Supreme Court decided in 2018, the Janus case that was on labor unions. And after that, we saw a mass of lawsuits. And in fact, even earlier this year, I was talking about just the incredible volume that we saw. I mean, we saw close to 80 lawsuits that were filed in the wake of that Janus decision over a pretty short period. I mean, it was like 12 to 18 months. We had almost 80 lawsuits filed in Janus. But in COVID, we're estimating about 250 civil liberty lawsuits that have been filed in like 3 months. So
Wow.
3 times the volume of Janus in a fraction of the time period. And so hopefully we won't see this again. I hope we've kind of reached a pinnacle, at least in our lifetimes of this volume. But the other thing that makes COVID so different is the pace of these lawsuits. So I mean, these are all filed as emergency actions, which means the courts are deciding them in a matter of hours or days, when normally, you would see months or years for this litigation. In fact, the Janus litigation it's just beginning to work its way up to the second level, the Court of Appeals. And in these COVID cases, we already have some petitions to the Supreme Court, and we've got tons of decisions on the books. Again, this is a matter of months. And so those are some key ways that we're seeing that COVID is really unique.
Wow. I had no idea that there were that many cases. So from your view, how does litigation fit into the bigger picture when we're talking about defending freedom?
Yeah, litigation is one tool in the tool belt. I mean, there are a lot of different ways that we need to protect and defend our constitutional rights. Litigation is one of them. One of the things that I think is really unique about litigation, unlike some of the other tools, which say are, electing good politicians or policy research and grassroots efforts, litigation is different because it lasts so long. Politicians come and go very quickly in the grand scheme of things. Even legislation that's passed can be tweaked and changed many times over the years. And these lawsuits, these legal opinions, usually last generations. I mean, they're on the books for decades, if not hundreds of years. And that's really what makes litigation special. This can be a great thing when we have successful cases that are going to be on the books for many decades. But it, cuts the other way when we have a negative precedent that can be on the books for a very long time. That's what we've seen in the takings cases. We've got those claims, the laws, the doctrine in that area that says we can't file these lawsuits and win them yet. So that rolling that back takes a long time. And that's why it's so important for litigators to be strategic. And Tracy, you mentioned, the American Jurislink role of making sure that groups are talking to one another and connecting and strategizing and really being unified and careful in their efforts to move forward, because you can do major damage when you bring a case. It's not like legislation where you might run something and it fails and you can try it again next year and tweak it and get better. And litigation is not that way. You can really blow up a total, pathway that was once open, and that can happen very quickly.
So a lot of our philanthropic partners have asked about funding litigation efforts. So what do they need to know if they want to add litigation to their own tool belts?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, we need more litigation and we need more funding for that litigation, but we need the funding to be strategic. And that's where investors have to be careful in their vetting. And I would encourage them to talk to SPN and consult with you guys. You have a great view of what's going on and you can help inform and educate the investors about what decisions they want to make.
Okay, thank you so much, Carrie Ann. We will return to Carrie Ann towards the end with Q&A. As a reminder, there is a Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen, so please jump in, join the conversation. We will take questions at the end. We're about to move on now to Sam McRoberts, again, who's General Counsel and Legislative Director of the Kansas Justice Institute. Sam, welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good. How are you? How are things in Kansas?
Not too bad, not too bad. It's getting warm, so the Kansas heat is now upon us, which is not good.
I hear you. As I said earlier, I don't necessarily mind to wear a mask, but it is awfully hot here in South Carolina as well, so I understand. Now, let's just start by digging into Kansas Justice Institute. What exactly do you guys do?
Well, we litigate for liberty. That is our foremost function. That's what we are designed to do, and that's what we're doing. That's our primary focus.
Okay, and what exactly has your team been doing to protect freedoms during the pandemic?
So litigating for liberty, that is the number one thing that we have been doing. And we filed a case recently in Federal District Court of Kansas. It was a COVID-related case where a local health officer had put together an order requiring businesses to compile lists of patrons, of anybody who had stepped foot in certain businesses, which included law firms and included doctors' offices. And then the health officer could go in and say, turn over the list. And these business owners had to turn over the list without any sort of pre-compliance review process. There was no ability for these businesses to object. And if they didn't turn them over, the argument from the government was, well, we can essentially criminally punish you if you don't compile a list and you don't turn them over.
Are you kidding? That's crazy. So what happened after that?
I had somebody reach out to Kansas Justice, and when I first heard about it, I thought there's no way that is going on in Lynn County, Kansas. And I took a look at the health order and I saw that's exactly what was going on. So we ended up representing Jackie Taylor, and Jackie runs the Lynn County newspaper. And we also represented Linda Jo Hisselin. Linda Jo runs this really cool diner in rural Lynn County, Kansas, and it's called Nana Joe's. And both of them had claims against the Lynn County health officer for different things. For Jackie Taylor, hers was she really didn't want to be tracked by the local health officer. So if Jackie wanted to go to her doctor's office, or if she wanted to go to the bank, or if she wanted to go to a restaurant, she was going to be included in these lists, whether or not she wanted to give her name or the time she got there. And for Linda Jo, she, like I said, runs this nice rural diner. She knows everybody who comes in. They're like family to her. And she felt very uncomfortable compiling lists of all of her clients, all of her patrons. And so they teamed up with the Kansas Justice Institute to file a federal case. And that case was based on a couple of different things, but primarily the Fourth Amendment, which prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures. So the argument was, hey, government, you cannot force a business to do this, and you can't force them to turn over documents, and you can't just come into a business and demand this information. So we filed the federal case on a Sunday evening, and Carrie Ann just talked about how fast these cases go, and ours was no exception. It was just like what she was saying. We were working, 18 hours a day on the case from Sunday through Friday. And on the following Friday, we had a very long court hearing about our case. And by that Sunday afternoon, the county health officer changed his health order. And so by the following Monday, essentially the case was over with because we had, for all intents and purposes, won that matter.
That is, what a story. Wow. Now, is this happening in other counties and cities across the country?
Well, in terms of COVID litigation, absolutely. In terms of whether or not counties were forcing businesses to require this information and collect it, the judge asked that same exact question. And we are not aware of any county that was doing just what Lynn County was doing. So it was a one-of-a-kind type case with issues that are going to last for a long time. Just like Carrie Ann said, Fourth Amendment litigation, we're still hearing about cases from the 1940s, 1950s, and so on. So that's why our case was so important.
Tracy, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just noting that if not for Kansas Justice Institute, who would the little guy have to turn to? I see so much of this network standing up for the rights of the little guy, right? And now moving into the space that perhaps the left is left abandoned of civil rights and protecting free speech. This is another reason why these litigators are doing such important work out in the States. I'm really pleased with that story.
That's a great question though. Where does the little guy turn to? And lawyers are expensive. And so Jackie Taylor and Linda Jo could not have essentially afforded to pay for an attorney to try to fight this case, because that would have cost them tens of thousands of dollars to try to fight a local health authority. So they just, for all practical purposes, would have just said, let's just deal with this, let's move on, and hopefully this doesn't come about. And that's why there's such a need for Kansas Justice Institute, because we're free. We're a pro bono litigation firm. And so that's our mission, is to get in and help the little guy push back whenever the government is doing something that in my mind is crazy, which this was.
Yeah, that's a great point. And to Tracy's earlier point, her remarks at the beginning of the show, Sam, isn't it true that your litigation center is sort of a sister organization, if you will, of the Kansas Policy Institute? So it's the think tank with the litigation arm, trying to get things done in the state and represent the people.
Yeah, and it's a great mix, because Kansas Policy Institute, they kind of see things a little bit through the legislative lens. And from time to time, what will happen is they're talking about an issue, and then I say, wait a sec, there's some movement here for some litigation. And they say, you're right, like we didn't really think about it this way. And then there's sometimes where people will present cases to me, and then I say, I just don't think that's a good litigation case. And then I can talk to Kansas Policy Institute, and then we can deal with that matter. But going back to how we're related with Kansas Policy Institute, what is very cool is after we filed our case, after we won it, it really spurred the Kansas Attorney General into going back to the legislature. And then he pushed for COVID-related legislation that was also supported by Kansas Policy Institute to prevent the very thing that we had to sue over. So when we're talking about these tools in the tool belt or toolbox, it was a great mix, because we spurred the Attorney General into action. We got the legislature's attention, and then it all worked out just the way we wanted it to.
Yeah, okay, you're hitting a hot button with me, is where I'm glad you brought that up, because getting state legislatures into the rightful spot to help curb and put checks and balances on some of these emergency powers. I'm not saying we should do away with all emergency powers, but I think these governors need some checks and balances, and a lot of that should come from state legislatures. And where there is either by shirking their duty or neglecting, the courts have to step in. So to see how this came full circle to really move the legislature to action is a good sign.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things, right after we had raised this issue, the governor herself started commenting about our case. And so it really did, part of the whole process is we make this case public, right? We've got media, we're making sure that people know who Jackie Taylor is, who know who Linda Jo is, and how these silly regulations or silly health orders are really making a very real impact on people's lives. And so you're absolutely right. People did start paying attention because of the litigation.
That's great. Now, when you were telling the story, you mentioned that things were moving quickly with this case. Are you a member of American Jurislink? And if so, did that help you move along faster?
Oh yeah, Carrie Ann was awesome. I feel bad for her, so I apologize to you, Carrie Ann. I was sending her late night emails. She was responding at 2 or 3 in the morning, but she was really helpful. And American Jurislink was very helpful because I could bounce ideas off of the Mississippi Justice Institute. I could bounce ideas off Beacon in Tennessee. I could reach out to Maurice in Ohio. And Carrie Ann did a great job of helping facilitate that through video conferencing. And right now, Kansas Justice Institute has one lawyer, that's me. And so if I get into a situation where I want to bounce ideas, make sure I'm not getting too far over my skis or coming up with too imaginative litigation, then Carrie Ann and others can help check me. So it was very, very helpful. And Carrie Ann was great in that regard.
Good. So Sam, it's just you. You're the only litigator. So what, moving forward, where's your focus going to be on upcoming cases?
Yeah, so we still have a very big focus on COVID litigation. And I don't think, even though some of the health orders have been rescinded, and especially in Kansas with the governor kind of taking a step back, we've seen a spike in cases. And so I anticipate that now local health officers are going to start implementing new orders. And just like Carrie Ann was saying, we're seeing the same things where maybe a restaurant is allowed to open, but not a bar that serves food. But then there's no actual definition for the difference between a restaurant and a bar. And that raises really fundamental questions of how can you do this? And in some cases, it's criminalizing that kind of action. So if you were to open up a bar that serves food, you could potentially serve a jail sentence over that. So I do think we're going to be focused on paying attention to what's going on in all of our counties. And I take a look at all the local health orders as they come out, and I fully anticipate we're going to be litigating COVID cases all the way through 2020 and even to the spring.
Well, so you said yourself right off the bat that you're there to litigate for liberty. As you've been getting phone calls from folks, other than what you just mentioned, are there any other trends you're hearing that give you pause?
Yeah, so it was really interesting because as soon as the governor started issuing her executive orders, I didn't hear much complaints from people or many complaints from people. I think for the most part, people were scared by COVID. They weren't sure how this was going to impact their lives. And so at the very beginning, everyone kind of took a let's do a wait and see approach. Mm-hmm. And then very quickly after that, when we started seeing arbitrary orders or things that just did not make sense, that's when we started getting a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails. And this whole process has been very interesting in the sense that we'll get a ton of phone calls one week, and then all of a sudden things start to change with the health orders, and then they kind of die off a little bit. But mm-hmm. I think this is going to ramp back up again very, very quickly. In fact, this morning, I had people reach out to me about things that I don't want to talk too much about, but they just don't make sense. And so I have a feeling we'll be engaged in further litigation.
Well, thanks, Sam. We look forward to hearing more as the days go on from you and from Carrie Ann as well. So let's turn it over to the Q&A portion of our show. Again, at the bottom of your screen, there's a little box. If you have a question you'd like to add, please feel free. I'll start with some of the questions that were submitted before the show starts. So, starting with Ed Johnson's question. Ed, I'm so glad you're back. Hope you're doing well today. Ed's asking, how are these lawsuits vetted to ensure that bad law and precedent is minimized? So Carrie Ann, let's start with you, and then we'll get Sam's thoughts as well.
Yeah, it's so important. And it's really heartening to hear that from your viewers too, that's a concern for them, because it's often something that we have to explain and re-explain. And even among lawyers, sometimes lawyers, especially outside of our network, don't think that through. And certainly among non-lawyers, it's not intuitive, right? Because it's not, it's not what you see with the other tools in the tool belt. You don't have that same reservation when you're running legislation or when, a politician is going to throw their name in the ring. So it is really important. And there's several things that we do. I mean, it's within our own community. That's one of the reasons that we started hosting the COVID Roundtables. We are getting the strategic thinkers from each of the big public interest law firms. So these are the senior level people, the directors or the managers, the ones who are setting the course of litigation for their own particular office. And we're getting them all in a virtual room every couple of weeks. And we're talking about what's wise, how do we need to select these cases, and where are the courts ready to move, and where should we withhold because it's not worth it. You know, a lot of the things we talk about might be just protecting against that bad precedent. So it's so important.
Sam, anything to add?
Yeah, I have an advisory council of attorneys. And so our process is, well, I informally run it through KPI, and we have a discussion, does this fit our institutional goals? And then I go through our advisory council. We discuss that. And then I have an advisory board that I go through. And by the time everybody kind of vets the case, then we have a pretty good feel for where we're going, and fully acknowledging that bad case law exists out there. We don't want to be a part of that. We've all talked about bad precedent. We're still dealing with today a case that came out, Jacobson v. Massachusetts in 1905, that is impacting our COVID litigation. And that case is a thorn in my side and everyone's side. And so we just want to make best possible efforts not to end up getting a Jacobson v. Massachusetts case in 2020.
Wow. All right. Tracy, anything to add?
No, I'm writing down Jacobson.
Okay, yeah, me too. Okay.
Bad case.
Somebody submitted a question, and this is a great question that I should have asked myself. Do you guys see any COVID cases going to the Supreme Court level? Carrie Ann?
Yeah, I was looking at that recently. So we've got a few petitions that are pending, and I imagine we'll see more and more petitions going up. So far, the Supreme Court hasn't accepted review of any of these cases. And I don't know if they will or not, but certainly the petitions are going to be filed. They're making their way through the courts very, very quickly. And we'll see what the court is inclined to do.
All right. Anything to add, Sam?
As a lawyer, I want to hedge my bets and say I'm not sure, and I hate predicting the future, but it seems to me like something's going to have to get up to the Supreme Court. Although they want to take a wait and see approach, they want to see how cases are percolating through the different circuits. But it seems unlikely to me that the Supreme Court's not gonna get some sort of COVID case.
Okay, and I guess carrying on this train of thought, Brent Davis asked, how are we supposed to protect ourselves from lower court decisions being later overturned by an activist Supreme Court? Any thoughts on that?
I wish, you know, if there was a great strategy, we would certainly be executing it. And I don't know, you know, that's the structure of our court system, is one level up to the next level, up to the next level. And sometimes we get the good decision below and the bad one up high. And sometimes it's reversed. And all we can do is litigate the best case that we can. And I will say that the lawyers in our network are extremely bright and accomplished and very experienced at the appellate level. You know, there's not a lot of trials. Our attorneys almost never stop at the first trial court level. So I would say that's the one thing at least we have going for us at the higher, when you get to the higher levels, they're not going to win every time. But for every time that we're reversed at a higher level, you know, we're often, it's flipped and we're succeeding in overturning a bad lower court decision.
All right. Anything to add, Sam?
Yeah, it's all about trying to get the best fact pattern with the best possible client and making the best possible argument you can make. And sometimes you can do all the right things and still lose the case. I've been practicing for, I don't know, about 14 or 15 years. And I've seen cases where I just could not believe that's how a court ruled. But that's what happens in our field. And you just have to deal with it. And you got to keep in mind that part of what we're doing is making this a public case. And so think about Little Pink House. We lost at the Supreme Court, but then that sparked change all across the country to go back to state legislatures to make sure that that doesn't happen again in your state. So even if you're losing because you've got the right facts and the right client, you can still win later on. So hope is not lost, even if you, quote unquote, lose in court.
Yeah,
I see that as it's a benefit with Kansas Justice Institute, so closely partnered with Kansas Policy Institute, that they, KPI can amplify the facts and what you're trying to accomplish at KJI. So it's a virtuous cycle that way in amplifying those ideas and facts.
Yeah. Well, let's shift from talking about COVID for a moment to Byron Lamb's question. Byron, thanks for coming back to the show. So good to have you with us today. Byron wanted to know if there's any new areas of activity right now around education and the environment. What are you guys seeing there? Carrie Ann, we'll start with you. Sorry.
Yeah. You know, we're definitely seeing cases. We always have, and we probably always will, about it, you know, around education and the environment. In fact, there's even, you know, COVID cases around these school shutdowns. I remember seeing in a couple of states, governors had ordered virtual charter schools to shut down as part of the shutdown orders, which was just floored me. And so we're hopeful, you know, ideally that would never happen, but it did roll back eventually. And then I think they're still kind of picking up the pieces there about whether new students can be admitted. But we're always going to see those. I think there's always going to be room for litigation in that area. I wish we could say we've nailed this, you know, we've nailed environmental law and there's no more work to be done. And there just will be. I mean, in our lifetimes, we're not going to close the book on those issues. And so we really need more work there.
Okay. Sam?
I completely agree with Carrie Ann. This litigation is going to continue in Kansas. We've got education cases that have been, for all intents and purposes, going on for 20 years. And so that's not going to stop anytime soon. And that is an area where every day we talk about institutionally, or at least every week we talk about institutionally, where is a good place for us to get involved. Also keeping in mind, we don't want to create bad precedent. And in terms of environmental cases, I haven't seen that as much in Kansas, but I fully expect to see that in Kansas. And so we just have to be ready to engage in litigation where it's appropriate and push back where the government is interfering with people's businesses and their rights, their individual liberties. And so just kind of know that that exists and be ready to jump in as soon as it makes sense to do so.
And I will say for Byron, you know, I'm thinking back to when I first started with Clint Bullock at the Goldwater Institute, and we would always say, you know, our lifelong dream, our ultimate career goal would be to put ourselves out of business. I don't know if we're going to get there, but that for sure is what we're shooting for.
I agree with that, but the government can get squirrely, so they'll just keep moving the ball or moving the goalposts.
Squirrely, that's true. Given that there's 250 some odd COVID cases, you know, give it a week, maybe we will have a K-12 education case related to COVID. Who knows? I mean, I'm not saying I know anything, but there might be something. And the fact is that the network is ready for it. I'm so heartened because I'm hearing how fast these cases move, but how strategic and agile your operations are. And I think that's really a sign of strength in this network to be able to respond to needs, to spot gaps, and to quickly, smartly, and strategically move into arenas, get lots of advisors, not be hasty, but to be smart. But speed does matter. And so to be able to thoughtfully engage in this way is a real strength of this network. And I think it gives us a lot of opportunity in the days ahead.
That's absolutely right. Now, we've got one more question, and it is about that time we usually end. So if you guys have to hop off, don't worry, we can send you a video if you're interested in the last question. Nisi Hamilton, thank you for joining us today, Nisi, has a great question. Have you guys had any cases to do with laws governing elections? What do you guys see in Carrie Ann?
Oh man, there are so many. You know, when I came up with we're estimating the 250 cases that involve civil liberties. I was not even counting the election law cases. I mean, there's probably at least another 100 or so election law cases. We saw elections being canceled. We saw elections being moved. We're still dealing with election law issues around mail-in ballots and absentee ballots and stamps on the envelopes or postage required. And I think those are certain to continue through this year. The one that stands out in particular to me, there was a borough in New Jersey, and the candidate coming in was going to be challenged, or I'm sorry, the candidate coming in was going to be not liked by the establishment, and the ones going out, their time was up, and so they just said, we're not going to have this election. We're just going to leave. We're just going to leave the person in power, and we're going to reschedule it later. And it was very odd because it was done in one particular borough and not the rest of the boroughs. And it was just outrageous. I mean, nothing really seems off the table right now, but it's moving so quickly, and it's so easy to skip things, or to, in Arizona, we had an issue where the county recorder had just decided, I'm just going to mail absentee ballots to everybody. I'm just going to do it without folks requesting it. And there's real serious concerns about folks getting the message and double voting, whether they're going to get the mail-in ballot and then also vote in person. And fortunately, our attorney general here nipped that in the bud pretty quickly and said, hey, that's definitely going too far. We had great partnership there working on those issues, but I think those are very hot button, and those are very, very fast. And
are they generally, are most of them going our way or not our way?
That's a tough question. I think it's probably like the civil liberties cases, where depending on the type of issue you're looking at, some of them tend to be going our way. And if it's a different type of issue, then it's going to tend to go the other way. Okay. But these are the biggest problem that we face is, once you open the door, right? Once you say, we're going to put stamps on all of the mail-in ballots, or once, another big issue is who can actually help somebody with their ballot and mail it for them. And that's a really big concern, is, even in places like nursing homes, where, there's this push to get anybody, any nurse or any worker there, or anybody who comes into the nursing home, to talk to all of the residents there about how to cast their ballots. And once you open that door, that's not going to go away. I mean, if the government moves forward in that direction and we have that on the books, it's going to stay on the books. Or if the courts don't strike it down, then it's not going to be struck down. And that's not going to be COVID specific. It's COVID initiated, but it's going to last a very long time. So we've got folks who are on that special topic, who all they do is election law.
Well, we could dedicate a whole show to that. We might come back to it. Sam, are you seeing anything on that topic in Kansas?
Well, we're watchdogging it. We're taking a look at everything just to see what's happening. So far, we haven't seen anything that is worthy of litigation yet, but that doesn't mean that, by 3 p.m. today, something hasn't popped up, and we'll be ready to rock and roll.
Good. All right. We had one more question come in around HIPAA laws. This is from Art Gentry. Art, thanks for being a part of the show today. Art wants to know, is there any way through a barrier that is thrown up with privacy and HIPAA laws through the courts?
Yeah, and actually the privacy and HIPAA laws, there's one particular case that comes to mind where, and actually it's similar, Sam, to your case, where you have the government coming in and saying, we need to collect all this information and we need you to report it to us. There are real concerns. I remember getting a call a couple of weeks back from a hotel in California where, she said, hey, our California laws, we're not supposed to share the names of the people staying with us. And Sam, I know you had that same thing come up in Kansas, where it was like, doctors now have to report their patients, and lawyers, even the fact that you meet with a client, that fact itself is protected by the attorney-client privilege, and certainly can tip off the government if you've got, a certain named individual with their address and the phone number, and you can see their meeting schedule with a tax attorney or with, some other, type of attorney. I mean, that fact in of itself is privileged information, whether it's HIPAA or attorney-client, and certainly other levels of privacy. And so we're definitely seeing that in the COVID context. And, luckily Sam was there to jump all over it in Kansas. And I know other attorneys are investigating similar issues in their states.
Right. Okay. Well, that brings us to the end of today's show. Tracy, do you have any parting thoughts you'd like to share before we go?
Just that this has been invigorating. I'm really encouraged by the work that's been done out there. This is indeed a durable freedom infrastructure where you have think tanks working, locking arms with litigators to really press forward, to be strategic, to be agile. This is how we're going to have state solutions, national impact in both the short term and the long term. So I'm grateful for our panelists today. Appreciate all they do in this really busy time. And I appreciate all our viewers coming in and our supporters that help make this work possible.
Thanks, Tracy. And thanks, Sam and Carrie Ann and all of you who tuned in today. I know the majority of our shows, if you've been tuning in since we launched in March, have been around the pandemic. We're all feeling that we all know there's a lot more going on in our country right now than simply the pandemic. There are a lot of deep-rooted issues that are affecting our lives. And so we're going to shift gears on July 8th. I hope you'll join us to talk about how this network is approaching sensible police reform. So join us for that show. I think it'll be a good one. And thanks for everything you guys do to make this possible. We'll see you on July 8th.
Take care, everyone.